The dusty streets of Fairplay, Colorado, had seen more than their fair share of desperation in the summer of 1883. But nothing quite prepared Mason Vaughn for the sight of the woman huddled against the weathered planks of the Silver Dollar Saloon that sweltering August afternoon. Mason had just finished selling 3 horses to the livery stable down the street, his pockets heavier with coin than they had been in months. The sun beat down mercilessly as he walked past the saloon, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. That's when he noticed her, a slender figure in a torn calico dress, her dark hair matted and falling loose from what had once been a proper bun. She sat with her back against the saloon wall, one hand extended toward passers-by, who either ignored her completely or crossed to the other side of the street to avoid her altogether. Most men in Fairplay would have kept walking. Mason almost did. But something in the way she held herself, the dignity in her posture despite her obvious destitution, made him stop. He stood there for a moment, watching as a well-dressed couple hurried past her without so much as a glance. The woman's face was turned downward, but he could see the hollow prominence of her cheekbones, the way her dress hung loose on what had clearly once been a fuller frame. Mason approached slowly, his shadow falling across her. She looked up, and he found himself staring into the most striking gray eyes he had ever seen. They were the color of storm clouds over the mountains, tired and wary but still somehow fierce. Her face was beautiful beneath the grime and exhaustion, with high cheekbones and full lips that looked cracked from thirst. "Miss," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. "When did you last eat?" She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was some kind of cruel joke. Her hand remained extended, trembling slightly. "3 days ago," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "A woman gave me half a biscuit." Mason felt something twist in his chest. Without another word, he reached down and took her extended hand in his. Her fingers were ice-cold despite the heat, and he could feel every delicate bone beneath the skin. She gasped at the contact, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. "Come on," he said gently, helping her to her feet. She swayed dangerously, and he quickly wrapped an arm around her waist to steady her. She was lighter than she should have been, and he could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. "Let's get you some food." "I cannot pay you," she said, her voice barely audible. She tried to pull away, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. "I have nothing." "I did not ask you to pay me," Mason replied. He guided her slowly down the street toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, which served meals to anyone willing to pay. The few people they passed stared openly, some with disapproval, others with curiosity. Mason ignored them all, focused entirely on keeping the woman upright and moving forward. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they walked, each step seeming to require enormous effort from her. "You do not even know me." Mason considered the question. He was not typically given to acts of charity. Life as a horse trader and occasional ranch hand had taught him to look after himself first. But something about this woman had struck him deeply, had called to something he had not even known existed within him. "Maybe I should know you," he said simply. They reached the boarding house, and Mason pushed open the door. The interior was blessedly cool, and the smell of fresh bread and stew filled the air. The woman beside him inhaled sharply, and he felt her sway again. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, looked up from behind the front desk. Her expression shifted from welcoming to suspicious when she saw Mason's companion. "Mason Vaughn," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What brings you here?" "Need a room and some meals," Mason said, fishing coins from his pocket. "And a bath drawn if you would be so kind." Mrs. Patterson's eyes flicked to the woman, taking in her disheveled appearance. "A room for two." "Separate rooms," Mason said firmly, meeting her gaze. "The lady needs assistance, Mrs. Patterson. I would appreciate your discretion and your kindness." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. She nodded and took the coins he offered. "Room 4 for you, Miss Vaughn, and room 7 for Mr. Vaughn." "My name is not Vaughn," the woman said quietly. "I am Clara Caldwell." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Caldwell," Mrs. Patterson said, her tone warming further. "Let me get you situated. Mary," she called toward the kitchen, "draw a bath in room 4 and bring up a plate of whatever's hot." A young girl appeared from the back, nodded, and scurried upstairs. Mrs. Patterson came around the desk and gently took Clara's other arm. "Come along, dear. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." Clara looked back at Mason, her gray eyes filled with confusion and something that might have been gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not understand why, but thank you." Mason watched as Mrs. Patterson led her upstairs, then sank into one of the chairs in the small sitting area off the main hall. His hands were shaking slightly, and he did not fully understand why. He had seen desperate people before. Fairplay was a mining town, and fortunes rose and fell with alarming regularity. But something about Clara Caldwell had reached inside him and taken hold. He spent the next hour sitting in that chair, watching the stairs and trying to make sense of his own actions. He had just spent a significant portion of his earnings on a complete stranger. He should have been angry with himself, or at least puzzled. Instead, he just felt an overwhelming need to know that she was all right. Mrs. Patterson came down eventually, her expression thoughtful. "She fell asleep in the bath," she said quietly, sitting down across from Mason. "Mary helped her into a nightgown and put her to bed. The poor thing ate half a bowl of stew so fast I thought she would be sick, then could not keep her eyes open another moment." "How bad is she?" Mason asked. "Thin as a rail and exhausted to her bones," Mrs. Patterson replied. "But I have seen worse. With regular meals and rest she should recover. The question is, what happened to her? A woman like that does not end up begging outside a saloon without a story behind it." "A woman like what?" Mason asked. "Educated," Mrs. Patterson said. "Did you hear the way she speaks? That is not the voice of some common drifter. She has had schooling, probably comes from a good family. Something terrible must have happened to bring her this low." Mason nodded slowly. He had noticed Clara's manner of speaking, the way she held herself despite everything. "I will pay for a week's room and board," he said. "After that, we will see where things stand." Mrs. Patterson studied him for a long moment. "That is very generous of you, Mason, but people will talk." "A young man paying for a young woman's keep. You know how this town is." "Let them talk," Mason said, more harshly than he intended. He softened his tone. "She needs help. That is all that matters." "You are a good man, Mason Vaughn," Mrs. Patterson said, patting his hand. "Your mother would have been proud." Mason felt the familiar ache at the mention of his mother, who had died of fever 3 years earlier. His father had followed her 6 months later, his heart simply giving up. Mason had been on his own ever since, drifting from town to town, trading horses and working ranches, never staying in one place too long. Fairplay was just another stop, or at least it had been until this afternoon. He took his own room that evening, but sleep eluded him. He lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the woman 4 doors down. Who was Clara Caldwell? Where had she come from? And why did he feel this inexplicable pull toward her? The next morning, Mason woke early and went downstairs to find Mrs. Patterson already up and preparing breakfast. "She is still sleeping," Mrs. Patterson said before he could ask. "That girl needed rest more than anything. Let her be for now." Mason spent the morning in town, checking on some horses he had left at the livery and making inquiries about potential buyers. But his mind was not on business. He found himself constantly thinking about Clara, wondering if she had woken yet, if she was all right. It was nearly noon when he returned to the boarding house. Mrs. Patterson met him at the door with a knowing smile. "She is awake," she said. "Had a proper breakfast and another bath. She is in the sitting room." Mason found Clara sitting by the window, looking out at the street. She had been provided with a simple but clean dress in a pale blue color that made her eyes seem even more striking. Her dark hair had been washed and braided, falling over one shoulder. She looked transformed from the desperate woman he had found yesterday, though she was still far too thin and there were dark circles under her eyes. She turned when she heard him enter, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. In the clear light of day, Mason could see that she was probably around his own age, perhaps 24 or 25 to his 26 years. Her features were refined and delicate, and there was an intelligence in her eyes that was immediately apparent. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, rising to her feet. She swayed slightly, and Mason quickly crossed the room to steady her. "Please sit," he said. "You should not be standing yet." Clara allowed him to help her back into the chair, then looked up at him. "Mrs. Patterson told me what you did," she said quietly. "Paying for my room and meals, giving me help when I had no right to expect it from anyone. I do not have words to properly thank you." Mason pulled over another chair and sat down facing her. "You do not need to thank me. I just want to know that you are all right." Clara was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap. "I am better than I was yesterday," she said finally, "though that is not saying much." She took a deep breath. "I suppose you want to know my story, why I was in such a state." "Only if you want to tell me," Mason said, though he desperately wanted to know. Clara looked out the window again, her expression distant. "I came to Colorado from Ohio 6 months ago," she began. "I was engaged to be married to a man named Robert Sterling. He was a mining engineer, and he had come out here 2 years earlier to make his fortune. He wrote to me every week, telling me about the opportunities here, about the life we would have together. When he sent for me, I came without hesitation." She paused, and Mason saw her hands tighten in her lap. "I arrived in Denver in February. Robert met me at the station, and we were married the next day. Everything seemed perfect. We traveled to a mining camp north of here where he was overseeing operations. But things changed almost immediately after the wedding." "What happened?" Mason asked quietly. "Robert was not the man he pretended to be in his letters," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He drank heavily and had gambling debts I knew nothing about. The position he claimed to have at the mine was far less important than he had led me to believe. Within a month, he had lost what little money he had at the card tables. He became angry, blamed me for being another mouth to feed." Mason felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "Did he hurt you?" Clara did not answer directly. "One night in late May, Robert came home after 3 days away. He told me he had lost everything in a poker game, including the claim to a small stake he had been working. He was drunk and angry, and we argued. He said terrible things, blamed me for ruining his life. Then he left. I thought he would come back in the morning, but he never did." "He abandoned you," Mason said, his hands clenching into fists. "I learned later that he had left Colorado entirely," Clara said. "One of the other miners told me Robert had taken what money he could scrape together and bought passage on a wagon train heading to California. He left me alone in a mining camp with no money, no friends, and no way to get home." "My God," Mason breathed. "I tried to find work," Clara continued. "But there was little opportunity for a woman in a mining camp, and what opportunities existed were not ones I could bring myself to take. I did laundry for some of the miners for a while, But when the mine started failing, people left. Eventually, I had to leave too. I made my way here to Fairplay, hoping a larger town would offer more opportunities. Why did you not wire your family for help? Mason asked. Surely they would have sent money for passage home. Clara's expression became pained. My family disowned me when I insisted on coming west to marry Robert. My father said I was throwing away my life, that Robert was not to be trusted. I thought I knew better. I cannot go back to them like this, prove that my father was right all along. I have too much pride for that, foolish as it may be. Mason leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Pride will not keep you fed or sheltered, Miss Caldwell. I know, she said, and there were tears in her eyes now. Believe me, I know. These past few weeks have taught me exactly how far pride will take you. But I cannot bring myself to crawl back to my father in defeat. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. They sat in silence for a moment. Mason struggled to process everything he had heard. Clara had been betrayed by someone she trusted, abandoned in a harsh land, and forced to fend for herself with no resources. The fact that she had survived this long was testament to her strength, even if that strength had finally reached its limit. What will you do now? He asked finally. Clara wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I do not know. Mrs. Patterson said you have paid for a week's lodging. I am grateful beyond words for that kindness. Perhaps in a week I will be strong enough to find some kind of work. There must be something I can do even here. Can you read and write? Mason asked. Mrs. Patterson said you were educated. Yes, Clara said. My mother insisted I have a proper education. I can read, write, do figures. I even taught school for a year before Robert asked me to marry him. Her expression grew bitter. Much good it has done me. An idea was forming in Mason's mind, but he pushed it aside for the moment. Rest and recover your strength, he said. We will figure out the rest later. Over the next few days, Mason found himself spending more and more time at the boarding house. He would come by in the mornings before heading out for the day, and again in the evenings to share supper. Clara grew stronger with each meal, the hollow look fading from her face, color returning to her cheeks. They talked for hours, and Mason found himself captivated by her intelligence and wit. Clara told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a wealthy banker who had expected her to marry into another prominent family. She described the frustration of being trained for nothing more than being a decorative wife, the longing she had felt for something more meaningful. Robert's letters had promised adventure and a fresh start, a chance to be part of building something new in the West. The reality had been crushing. Mason, in turn, told her about his own life. He described growing up on a small ranch outside of Denver, learning about horses from his father. He spoke of his parents' deaths and the wandering life he had led since, never quite finding a place where he felt he belonged. He had been good with horses, which had kept him fed and sheltered, but it was a lonely existence. Why have you never settled down? Clara asked one evening as they sat in the boarding house parlor. It was late, and Mrs. Patterson had already gone to bed, leaving a lamp burning low for them. Mason considered the question. Never found a reason to, I suppose. Every town feels the same after a while. Every job is temporary. I figured I would keep moving until something made me want to stop. And nothing ever has, Clara asked. Mason looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught in her gray eyes, at the gentle curve of her jaw and the intelligence in her expression. Not until now, he said quietly. Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then she looked away, color rising in her cheeks. Mr. Vaughn, I am not sure what you are suggesting, but you should know that I am not looking for another man to rescue me. I made that mistake once. I am not trying to rescue you, Mason said, leaning forward in his chair. At least, not beyond keeping you from starving in the street. What I am trying to do is get to know you. These past few days talking with you have been the best I've had in longer than I can remember." "We barely know each other," Clara protested, but her voice was uncertain. "Then let's change that," Mason said. "Give me a chance, Clara. Let me court you properly." Clara stood abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. "I am still married, Mason. Robert may have abandoned me, but the law still considers me his wife. Even if I wanted to accept your offer, and I am not saying I do, it would not be proper." Mason stood as well, maintaining a respectful distance. "Then we will find a way to end your marriage legally. There must be grounds for divorce or annulment given what Robert did." "Divorce?" Clara laughed bitterly. "Do you know what that would make me? A divorced woman in 1883. I would be a pariah, completely unmarriageable. Not that I am particularly eager to marry again, but I would rather not be branded a scarlet woman for the rest of my life." "Not if you married me," Mason said. The words were out before he fully realized what he was saying, but once spoken, he did not want to take them back. "Marry me, Clara. Once you are free of Robert, marry me." Clara stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "You cannot be serious. We have known each other less than a week. You do not know anything real about me." "I know enough," Mason said. "I know you are intelligent and strong. I know you have been through hell and survived it. I know that talking to you feels more natural than breathing, and that I think about you every moment we are apart. Maybe that is not enough for most people, but it is enough for me." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now. "You are insane. This is the most foolish thing I have ever heard, and I married a gambling drunk who abandoned me in a mining camp." "Then maybe we deserve each other," Mason said with a slight smile. "Two fools trying to make something good out of bad situations." Clara wiped at her tears, but a laugh escaped her, half sob and half something lighter. "I should say no. Any sensible person would say no." "But," Mason prompted, "but I find that my time being sensible did not work out so well for me," Clara said. "And these past few days with you have been the first time I have felt like a person again, rather than just a problem to be solved or ignored. So I am not saying yes, but I am not saying no either. Let us see what can be done about my marriage first, and then we can discuss your ridiculous proposal." Mason felt hope bloom in his chest. It was not a yes, but it was not a rejection either. "Fair enough," he said. "I will start making inquiries tomorrow." True to his word, Mason spent the next day talking to everyone in Fairplay who might have legal knowledge. He finally found a lawyer named Samuel Hendricks, who maintained a small office above the general store. Hendricks was a thin man with spectacles, and a practical manner that Mason appreciated. "Abandonment is grounds for divorce in Colorado," Hendricks said after Mason explained the situation, carefully avoiding names. "But you need to be able to prove it, and the process takes time. You would need to file a petition with the court, publish notice in case the husband wants to contest, and then wait for a judgment. It could take 6 months or more." "6 months," Mason repeated. It seemed like an eternity, but if that was what it took, he would wait. "There is another option," Hendricks said carefully. "If the marriage was never consummated, an annulment could be obtained much more quickly. But that requires the wife to testify to that fact, which many women are uncomfortable doing." Mason thought about Clara's reluctance to discuss the details of her marriage. He suspected there was more to the story than she had shared with him, but he would not press her. "I will discuss both options with the lady in question and get back to you." That evening, Mason laid out what he had learned to Clara. They were sitting in the boarding house parlor again, and Clara listened with a carefully neutral expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "The marriage was consummated," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Once, on our wedding night. Robert was drunk and rough, and afterward he seemed to regret it. He never touched me again in that way, but it happened, so an annulment is not an option. Mason felt a surge of anger toward the man who had treated Clara so poorly, but he pushed it aside. Then we file for divorce on grounds of abandonment. 6 months is not so long. 6 months during which I will be living on your charity, Clara said. Mason, you have already spent so much on me. I cannot continue to take from you without giving anything in return. You give me your company, Mason said. That is more than enough. It is not enough for me, Clara replied firmly. I need to find work to support myself. I will not be a kept woman, no matter how noble your intentions. Mason understood her need for independence, even admired it. What kind of work were you thinking? I saw a notice at the general store, Clara said. The school here needs a teacher. The last one left to get married, and they are starting the fall term next week. I am qualified, and it would give me a purpose beyond sitting here feeling sorry for myself. Teaching would be perfect for you, Mason said, but then a thought occurred to him. Wait, would they hire you? You are technically still married. I thought about that, Clara said. I will present myself as a widow, Mrs. Sterling, whose husband died in a mining accident. It is close enough to the truth, is it not? Robert is dead to me. Mason did not like the deception, but he understood the necessity. A married woman whose husband had abandoned her would be seen as scandalous, but a widow was respectable. If anyone asks, I will back up your story. The next day, Clara went to meet with the school board. She wore the best dress Mrs. Patterson could lend her and carried herself with a confidence that Mason found inspiring. She returned several hours later with a smile on her face that made Mason's heart skip. I have the position, she announced as she found him waiting in the boarding house parlor. I start on Monday. The pay is not much, but it includes a small cottage behind the schoolhouse. I will finally be able to stop imposing on your generosity. Mason should have been happy for her, and he was, but the thought of Clara moving out of the boarding house filled him with unexpected anxiety. You are not imposing, he said, but I am glad you found something that will make you happy. Clara sat down across from him, her expression becoming serious. Mason, I need to say something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. He nodded, bracing himself. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect from anyone, Clara began. You saved my life, truly. If you had not stopped that day outside the saloon, I do not know what would have become of me. You have asked for nothing in return, made no demands, treated me with respect and dignity when I had been stripped of both. For all of that, I am more grateful than I can express. But, Mason said, sensing there was more. But I need you to understand that I am not the same naive girl who came west believing in fairy tales, Clara continued. I have been broken and barely put back together. I do not know if I am capable of being the kind of wife you deserve. I do not know if I can trust my own judgment when it comes to men. What if I am making another terrible mistake? Mason moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. Clara, I am not asking you to be anyone other than who you are. I do not need you to be perfect or to have all the answers. I just need you to give us a chance. What if I hurt you? She whispered, tears in her eyes. What if I am too damaged to love properly? Then we will figure it out together, Mason said. But I do not believe you are damaged, Clara. Hurt, yes. Betrayed and worn down, absolutely, but not damaged. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. Clara leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. You make me want to believe in good things again, she said softly. That terrifies me. Then be terrified, Mason said, a slight smile in his voice. But be terrified with me, not alone. Clara pulled back slightly to look at him, and then, before either of them could think better of it, she kissed him. It was tentative and brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but it sent electricity through Mason's entire body. When she pulled away, her eyes were wide with surprise at her own boldness. "I am sorry," she started to say, but Mason stopped her. "Do not be sorry for that," he said firmly. "Do not ever be sorry for that," Clara laughed, a real laugh that lit up her whole face. "You are going to be trouble, Mason Vaughn. Is that a yes to my ridiculous proposal?" he asked hopefully. "It is a maybe," Clara said. "Let us see how these next 6 months go. If you still want to marry a divorced schoolteacher after all that time, then perhaps we can discuss it." It was not everything Mason wanted, but it was enough. He stood, helping Clara to her feet, and they stood there for a moment, hands clasped, looking at each other with tentative hope. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Mason helped Clara move into the small cottage behind the schoolhouse, which was barely more than a one-room cabin but was hers alone. He repaired the leaky roof, fixed the broken window, and helped her clean years of accumulated dust and dirt. Mrs. Patterson donated some spare furniture and linens, and several of the townswomen, hearing that a new teacher had arrived, came by with supplies and offers of assistance. Clara threw herself into preparing for the school term with an energy that amazed Mason. She organized the small classroom, prepared lessons, and met with parents to understand what their children needed. Mason watched her transform from the desperate woman he had found outside the saloon into someone vibrant and purposeful, and he fell more in love with her with each passing day. He also began the legal process of filing for Clara's divorce. Samuel Hendricks drew up the necessary papers, and Clara signed them with a steady hand. The notice of divorce proceedings was published in the local newspaper, giving Robert Sterling 30 days to respond if he chose to contest. No one expected him to appear. Mason found work at a ranch outside of town, breaking horses and helping with the general operation. It was steady work that paid well, and it kept him in Fairplay rather than drifting to the next town. For the first time in years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond simple survival. He was building something, working toward a future that involved more than just himself. He and Clara fell into a comfortable rhythm. He would stop by the schoolhouse in the evenings after work, and they would sit on the small porch of her cottage and talk about their days. Clara would tell him about her students, the challenges and triumphs of teaching children from different backgrounds and abilities. Mason would share stories from the ranch, the quirks of the horses he was working with, the characters among the ranch hands. Slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Mason discovered that Clara loved thunderstorms, that she hummed while she cooked, that she had a sharp sense of humor that could catch him off guard and make him laugh. Clara learned that Mason was patient and thoughtful, that he had a gift for understanding animals that bordered on uncanny, that he was kind to a fault but fierce when protecting those he cared about. They also navigated the boundaries of their growing relationship. Mason was always careful to leave before it got too late, conscious of Clara's reputation. They held hands, shared occasional brief kisses, but went no further. It was both sweet and frustrating, this careful dance of restraint and desire. The townspeople of Fairplay watched this courtship with varying degrees of approval and skepticism. Some saw Mason's devotion as admirable. Others whispered about the propriety of a young widow being courted so soon after her supposed husband's death. Clara heard some of the whispers and tried not to let them bother her, but Mason could see the way they weighed on her. "Let them talk," he told her one evening when she seemed particularly troubled. "People always find something to gossip about. In a month, they will have moved on to something else." "But what if they find out the truth?" Clara asked. "What if someone discovers that Robert is not dead, that I am still married and lying about it?" "Then we deal with it," Mason said simply. "But worrying about it now does not help anything." You are doing good work with those children, Clara. That is what matters. Indeed, Clara had become beloved by her students in the short time she had been teaching. She had a gift for making learning engaging, for seeing the potential in each child and drawing it out. Mason sometimes stopped by during the day to drop off firewood for the school stove or to make small repairs, and he would watch through the window as Clara taught, marveling at her patience and creativity. Autumn arrived in Fairplay with a sudden cold snap in early October. The aspens in the mountains turned golden, and snow began to appear on the highest peaks. Mason bought Clara a warm coat from the general store, along with gloves and a knitted scarf, knowing the little schoolhouse would be drafty in the coming winter. She protested the expense, but he could see the gratitude in her eyes. "I can take care of myself," she insisted, but her fingers traced the soft wool of the coat with obvious pleasure. "I know you can," Mason replied, "but that does not mean you have to. Let me do this for you, Clara. Let me take care of you in the ways I can." Clara looked up at him, her expression soft. "You are making it very hard to maintain my independence," she said, but there was no real complaint in her voice. "Good," Mason said, grinning. Then more seriously he added, "I want to be your partner, Clara, not your savior. There is a difference." "I am beginning to see that," Clara said quietly. One cold evening in late October, Mason arrived at Clara's cottage to find her sitting on the porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at nothing. He immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, sitting down beside her. Clara handed him a letter without a word. Mason unfolded it and read quickly. It was from Samuel Hendricks, the lawyer. The 30-day notice period had passed without response from Robert Sterling. The divorce could now proceed to the next stage, which would involve a court hearing and final judgment. Hendricks estimated it would take another 2 to 3 months. "This is good news," Mason said, looking at Clara in confusion. "Why do you look so troubled?" "Because it is all becoming real," Clara said. "I am about to become a divorced woman, Mason. Do you understand what that means? Even out here in Colorado, where things are supposed to be more progressive, divorced women are looked down upon. What if the school board finds out and dismisses me? What if your proposal was just a kind gesture, and when the time comes, you realize you do not want to marry a woman with such a stain on her character?" Mason set the letter aside and took Clara's face in his hands, gently but firmly. "Look at me," he said. When her gray eyes met his, he continued, "I love you, Clara Caldwell. I have loved you since the moment I took your hand outside that saloon, though it took me a little while to understand what I was feeling. The divorce does not change that. Your past does not change that. Nothing changes that." Clara's eyes widened. "You love me, with everything I have," Mason confirmed. "And I am going to marry you the moment that divorce is final if you will have me. Not because I feel obligated, not because I pity you, but because I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have been so afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do. I love you, Mason Vaughn." Mason kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, pouring all of his feelings into that kiss. Clara responded with equal fervor, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other close as the cold wind whipped around them. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said again. "As soon as the law allows, marry me." "Yes," Clara said, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice. "Yes, I will marry you." The next months were both the longest and shortest of Mason's life. He continued working at the ranch, saving every penny he could toward building a future with Clara. He found a piece of land just outside of Fairplay, a few acres with good water and mountain views, and purchased it with money he had been saving for years. He spent his free time clearing ground and beginning to build a small house, enlisting the help of some of the ranch hands who had become friends. Clara continued teaching and began to be more accepted by the community. Her dedication to her students was evident, and even the most skeptical townspeople had to admit that she was doing an excellent job. The children adored her, and their parents' initial reservations gave way to respect and appreciation. Mason and Clara spent every evening together, either at her cottage or at the building site where their future home was taking shape. They talked about everything and nothing, making plans for their life together. Clara wanted to continue teaching, and Mason supported that fully. He would focus on horse trading and maybe starting a small breeding operation on their land. It would not make them rich, but it would be honest work they both found fulfilling. The divorce hearing took place on a bitterly cold day in January 1884. Mason accompanied Clara to the small courthouse, holding her hand tightly as they faced the judge. Robert Sterling had never responded to any of the notices, and the evidence of his abandonment was clear. The judge, a stern but fair man named Harrison Wade, granted the divorce with little fanfare. "Mrs. Caldwell, you are hereby legally divorced from Robert Sterling," Judge Wade announced. "The marriage is dissolved and you are free to remarry should you choose." Clara squeezed Mason's hand so hard it hurt, but he did not care. She was free. They were free. They walked out of the courthouse into the bright winter sunshine, and Clara turned to Mason with tears in her eyes. "I cannot believe it is really over," she said. "It is over," Mason confirmed. "Now our beginning can start." They were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the boarding house, with Mrs. Patterson and Samuel Hendricks serving as witnesses. Clara wore a new dress that Mason had purchased, a deep blue that matched the Colorado sky. Mason wore his best clothes, his hair neatly trimmed and his boots polished. They stood in the boarding house parlor and spoke their vows in front of a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Fairplay. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Mason kissed Clara with all the love and hope he felt, and she kissed him back with equal passion. Mrs. Patterson wiped away tears of joy, and even the normally stoic Samuel Hendricks looked moved. That night, Mason carried Clara over the threshold of their still unfinished house. They had moved enough furniture into the main room to make it livable, including a bed that Mason had built himself. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting warm light over everything. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," Mason said as he set Clara on her feet. "Mrs. Vaughn," Clara repeated, testing the name. "I like the sound of that much better than Mrs. Sterling." They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that brought tears to both their eyes. It was nothing like Clara's terrible experience on her wedding night with Robert. Mason was patient and gentle, making sure Clara felt cherished and safe. When it was over, they lay tangled together under quilts, watching the firelight dance on the ceiling. "Happy?" Mason asked, pressing a kiss to Clara's forehead. "Happier than I ever thought I would be," Clara replied. 6 months ago I was begging in the street, ready to give up entirely. Now I am married to the best man I have ever known, living in a house we are building together with a job I love. It feels like a dream." "It is real," Mason assured her, "and it is only going to get better." And it did. Over the next year, Mason finished building their house, adding a second bedroom, a proper kitchen, and even a small barn for horses. Clara continued teaching and became a pillar of the Fairplay community. The whispers about her past faded as people saw the strength of her marriage and the quality of her character. Mason's horse trading business thrived. He had a gift for finding quality animals and matching them with the right buyers. He began to breed horses as well, focusing on sturdy mountain horses that could handle Colorado's terrain. Within a year, people were traveling from other towns to purchase Vaughn horses. Clara discovered she was pregnant in the fall of 1884, and Mason thought his heart might burst with joy. He became even more protective of her, constantly worrying about her health and well-being. Clara found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she told him when he tried to stop her from carrying water from the well. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "But none of those women were my wife carrying my child," Mason replied. "So humor me and let me help." Their son was born in May 1885, a healthy baby boy with his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him James, after Mason's father. Mason held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the rush of love he felt. Clara recovered quickly from the birth and returned to teaching that fall, bringing baby James with her to school. The children were fascinated by the baby, and it turned into unexpected lessons about infant development and child care. Mason would stop by during the day whenever he could. Unable to stay away from his wife and son for too long, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Mason and Clara worked hard, but they also made time for each other and for James. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, James nestled between them, and watch the sun set over the mountains. Mason would think about the man he had been before Clara, drifting aimlessly from town to town, and marveled at how much had changed. When James was 2 years old, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. Their daughter, Sarah, was born in the spring of 1888, a tiny, perfect baby with a fierce cry and her mother's stubborn chin. Mason fell in love all over again, and James became a devoted big brother, constantly wanting to help care for his baby sister. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. The horse breeding operation continued to grow, and Mason took on a couple of ranch hands to help with the work. Clara eventually reduced her teaching to part-time so she could spend more time with the children, though she never gave it up entirely. She loved teaching too much to walk away completely. Fairplay continued to grow and change as the mining industry shifted. Some mines closed, others opened. People came and went, but the Vaughn family remained, becoming one of the established families of the town. Mason served on the town council for several years, and Clara became known for her charitable work, never forgetting what it felt like to be desperate and alone. In the summer of 1895, Mason and Clara's third child was born, another son they named Thomas. By this time, James was 10 and already helping his father with the horses, showing the same natural talent Mason had. Sarah was 7, bright and curious, already reading far above her level. Mason looked at his family and felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened him. "Do you ever think about that day?" Clara asked him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. 12 years had passed since that August afternoon outside the saloon, but Mason knew exactly what day she meant. "All the time," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to just walking past you. I almost did, you know. I had actually taken several steps beyond you before I turned back." "What made you turn back?" Clara asked. She had never asked this question before, not in all their years together. Mason thought about it. "Honestly, I do not know. Something just pulled me back, made me look at you again. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was God, maybe it was just dumb luck. But whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day." Clara took his hand, their fingers interlacing automatically after so many years of the gesture. "I am grateful too. You took my hand and changed everything just like that. You gave me back my life, my hope, my future. You gave me love when I thought I would never feel it. "You gave me all those things too," Mason said. "I was drifting before you, going through the motions of living without really understanding what I was missing. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set and their children play, as they had done countless evenings before. James was showing Sarah how to braid a rope, while young Thomas toddled around nearby, chasing a patient old barn cat. It was an ordinary evening, no different from hundreds of others, but that was what made it perfect. Over the following years, Mason and Clara watched their children grow into remarkable individuals. James developed his father's gift with horses and eventually took over much of the daily operation of the breeding program. He was serious and hardworking, with a kind heart that reminded Clara of Mason in those early days. Sarah inherited her mother's love of learning and became a teacher herself, taking over Clara's position at the Fairplay school when Clara finally decided to retire. She was passionate about education and fought hard to ensure all the children in Fairplay, regardless of their family's circumstances, had access to quality schooling. Thomas was the most adventurous of the three, with a restless spirit that worried Clara until Mason reminded her that they had both been adventurous themselves once. Thomas worked the horse ranch with his father and brother, but also traveled extensively, buying and selling horses throughout Colorado and the surrounding territories. As Mason and Clara entered their 50s, they began to slow down a bit, leaving more of the heavy work to their children and the ranch hands. They had earned a comfortable life through decades of hard work, and they finally had time to simply enjoy each other's company. They would take long walks in the mountains, ride horses together like they had in the early days of their marriage, and spend hours talking about everything and nothing. James married in 1905, bringing his wife Elizabeth to live on the ranch property in a house Mason helped him build. They gave Mason and Clara their first grandchild in 1906, a little girl named Clara after her grandmother. Mason cried when he held his granddaughter for the first time, overwhelmed by the continuation of the family he and Clara had built from nothing. Sarah married a year later, a schoolteacher from Denver who had come to Fairplay for a visit and fallen in love with both the town and Sarah. They settled in Fairplay as well, buying a house in town near the school. Their first child, a boy, arrived in 1908. Thomas remained unmarried longer, focused on his work and travels, but he eventually met a spirited young woman named Catherine at a horse auction in New Mexico. They married in 1910 and settled on a portion of the Vaughn ranch land, building yet another house in the growing family compound. By 1915, Mason and Clara had 6 grandchildren with more on the way. Their house, once so empty with just the two of them, was constantly filled with family. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with all 3 of their children and their families gathering around the large table Mason had built years ago. On one such Sunday in the summer of 1915, after everyone had eaten and the grandchildren were playing outside, James raised his glass. "I want to propose a toast," he said. "To my parents who built all of this from nothing. You taught us what real love looks like, what hard work and dedication can accomplish, and what it means to be a family. Everything we have, everything we are, comes from you." Mason and Clara looked at each other, both blinking back tears. They had lived 32 years of marriage filled with love, challenges, triumphs, and everyday joys. They had raised 3 incredible children and were now watching those children raise families of their own. "We did not do it alone," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "We had each other, and that made all the difference." That night, after everyone had gone home, Mason and Clara sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before. The mountains were purple in the fading light, and the air was cool and sweet. "You have any regrets?" Mason asked, taking Clara's hand. Clara was quiet for a moment, considering. "Only that I wasted time with Robert when I could have been finding you sooner," she finally said. "But even that was necessary, I suppose. That experience made me who I am, and it brought me to Fairplay, to that day outside the saloon." "I will never forget seeing you there," Mason said. "Sitting against that wall, your hand extended but your head held high. Even at your lowest point, there was something unbreakable in you." "I was broken," Clara said softly. "I truly was, but you helped me put the pieces back together. You showed me that one act of kindness, one person willing to extend their hand, can change everything." Mason brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, the same gesture he had done thousands of times over the years. "I took your hand that day, but you gave me so much more in return. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love." "We gave those things to each other," Clara corrected. "That is what makes us work. We are partners in every sense of the word." They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. They had both lived long enough to see the turn of the century, to witness incredible changes in the world around them. Automobiles were starting to appear on the streets of Fairplay, and there was even talk of electricity coming to town. The wild days of the Old West were fading into history and legend. But through all those changes, through every challenge and triumph, Mason and Clara had remained constant. Their love had been tested by time, by hardship, by the everyday struggles of building a life together, and it had only grown stronger. In 1920, Mason and Clara celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, their 6 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. The family gathered at the original house, now expanded and improved over the years but still recognizable as the structure Mason had built with his own hands. Clara had organized a small celebration, though she tired more easily these days. She was 62 years old now, her dark hair streaked with silver, lines of life and laughter etched around her eyes. But to Mason, she was as beautiful as the day he first saw her, perhaps even more so. Mason, at 63, had slowed down considerably. His joints ached in cold weather, and he had turned over most of the ranch operations to James years ago. But his mind was still sharp, and his love for Clara had never diminished. If anything, it had deepened with each passing year, becoming as much a part of him as breathing. As the sun began to set on their anniversary celebration, Mason stood with some effort and cleared his throat. The chatter of family conversation quieted as everyone turned to look at him. 36 years ago, Mason began, his voice still strong despite his age, I married the woman who saved my life. He looked at Clara, who started to protest, but he held up a hand. I know you think I saved you that day outside the saloon, but the truth is, we saved each other. I was a drifter with no direction, no purpose, no real understanding of what life could be. You gave me all of that and more. Tears were streaming down Clara's face as Mason continued. We have built something remarkable together. Not just this ranch, not just this family, though both are incredible achievements. We built a partnership based on love, respect, and mutual support. We showed our children what a real marriage looks like, and now we are watching them build their own families on that foundation. Mason turned to address his children and grandchildren. The greatest gift I can give you is the example your grandmother and I have tried to set. Love fiercely, work hard, treat each other with kindness and respect, and never give up on each other. Life will test you. There is no avoiding that. But if you face those tests together, you can overcome anything. James stood and raised his glass. To Mason and Clara Vaughn, the foundation of this family and the example we all strive to follow. Everyone raised their glasses and echoed the toast. Clara stood, somewhat shakily, and Mason immediately moved to support her. She smiled at him gratefully before addressing the gathered family. "Your father has said most of what needs to be said," Clara began, "but I want to add one thing. Never underestimate the power of kindness." Mason's decision to help a desperate stranger changed both of our lives completely. Remember that when you see someone in need, you never know how one act of compassion might ripple out and change the world. The celebration continued into the evening, but Mason and Clara eventually retired to their bedroom, exhausted but happy. They lay in the bed Mason had built 40 years ago, hands clasped between them. "That was a good day," Clara said softly. "Every day with you is a good day," Mason replied. Clara laughed, the sound raspier than it once was but still musical to Mason's ears. "You old romantic. After all these years, you can still make me feel like a young bride." "You will always be my bride," Mason said. "From that first day until my last day, you are and will always be the love of my life." They drifted off to sleep like that, hands clasped, hearts intertwined, surrounded by the life they had built together. The years continued to pass. Mason and Clara celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1924, though the celebration was quieter as both were dealing with various health issues that came with age. They spent most of their days on the porch of their house, watching the comings and goings of their extended family, content to simply be together. On a warm evening in the summer of 1925, as the sun set over the mountains they both loved, Clara turned to Mason with a peaceful smile. "I have had a good life," she said. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "The best is yet to come," Mason replied, though he could see the weariness in her eyes. "Promise me something," Clara said, gripping his hand tightly. "When I am gone, do not grieve too long. Celebrate what we had, not what you have lost, and know that I will be waiting for you wherever the next journey takes us." "You are not going anywhere," Mason said, but his voice cracked. "Not yet." "Not yet," Clara agreed, "but someday, and I need to know you will be all right." Mason could not speak for a moment, emotion choking him. "I will never be all right without you," he finally managed. "But I promise to keep living, to keep being there for our family until we meet again." Clara passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, surrounded by her family. She was 66 years old and had lived a full, rich life, beyond anything she could have imagined when she sat begging outside that saloon 42 years earlier. Mason was devastated by her loss, but he kept his promise. He continued to live, continued to be present for his children and grandchildren, though part of him was always waiting to join Clara. He told stories about her constantly, ensuring that the younger generations understood what a remarkable woman she had been. On the anniversary of the day they met, Mason would always visit Clara's grave at the Fairplay cemetery. He would sit beside her headstone, which read Clara Vaughn, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, friend, and tell her about everything that had happened since her passing. Mason lived 3 more years after Clara's death. In that time, he saw the birth of several more great-grandchildren, watched his sons and daughter continue to build on the foundation he and Clara had laid, and found peace in knowing that their legacy would continue long after he was gone. He died quietly in his sleep in the summer of 1928, exactly 3 years after Clara's passing. He was 71 years old. His family laid him to rest beside Clara with a headstone that matched hers. Mason Vaughn, beloved husband, father, grandfather, friend. At his funeral, James stood before the gathered crowd of family and friends, and told the story his father had told him many times, of a cowboy who saw a desperate woman begging outside a saloon, who took her hand without fully understanding why, and who changed everything with that single act of kindness. "They saved each other," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "And in doing so, they built something that will last far beyond their lifetimes. Every person here, every life they touched, is part of their legacy. We are all here because a cowboy took a chance on helping a stranger, and a woman found the courage to accept that help. We are all here because they chose love." The Vaughn Ranch continued to operate for generations, passed down through the family. The story of Mason and Clara became a family legend, told to each new generation as an example of what real love looked like, of what could be accomplished when two people fully committed to each other. The small house Mason had built with his own hands was eventually incorporated into a larger family compound, but it was always preserved and maintained, a testament to where it all began. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren played in the same yard where Mason and Clara's children had played, rode horses that were descended from the animals Mason had bred, and learned the value of hard work, kindness, and love that Mason and Clara had demonstrated every day of their lives together. In Fairplay, Colorado, the Vaughn family name became synonymous with integrity, hard work, and community service. Sarah's descendants continued to teach in the local schools. James's descendants ran the ranch and horse breeding operation. Thomas's descendants became business owners and civic leaders. All of them carried forward the lessons Mason and Clara had taught. That one act of kindness could change everything. That love was the foundation of a good life, and that family was worth fighting for. The old Silver Dollar Saloon, where Mason had first seen Clara, was eventually torn down and replaced with a more modern building. But the spot where Clara had sat that August day in 1883 was marked with a small plaque, placed there by the Vaughn family in 1950. It reads simply, "Here began a love story that built a legacy." Tourists visiting Fairplay would sometimes ask about the plaque, and locals would tell them the story of the cowboy and the desperate woman, of the hand extended and accepted, of the love that grew from that simple act of human kindness. The story became part of Fairplay's history, a reminder of the town's rough but ultimately hopeful past. Clara's dream of ensuring all children had access to education led to the establishment of the Vaughn Educational Foundation in 1935, funded by the family and offering scholarships to students who might otherwise be unable to afford higher education. Hundreds of students benefited from the foundation over the decades, many going on to make significant contributions to their communities. Mason's dedication to his horses and his ranch established breeding lines that became famous throughout Colorado and beyond. Vaughn horses were known for their strength, intelligence, and gentle temperament, perfect for the mountain terrain. The ranch hosted an annual sale that brought buyers from across the country, continuing well into the 20th century. But more than these tangible legacies, Mason and Clara left behind something more precious, a model of what love could be. Their marriage had not been perfect. They had faced challenges, disagreements, and hardships like any couple. But they had faced them together, with respect, kindness, and an unshakable commitment to each other. They had shown their children that love was not just a feeling but a choice, made every day through actions large and small. They had demonstrated that real partnership meant supporting each other's dreams, sharing both burdens and joys, and never giving up even when things got hard in the end. The story of Mason and Clara Vaughn was not unusual in its elements. A man helped a woman in need. They fell in love, married, and built a life together. They raised children, worked hard, and grew old together. These were common experiences shared by countless couples throughout history. What made their story special was the depth of their commitment, the completeness of their partnership, and the legacy they built not just through their descendants, but through their example. They had taken a moment of connection outside a saloon in a dusty mining town and transformed it into a lifetime of love, a family that spanned generations, and a testament to the power of human kindness and compassion. The cowboy had taken the woman's hand that August day, and in doing so had changed everything. Not just for themselves, but for everyone their lives would touch, then and for generations to come. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. The understanding that every act of kindness, every moment of human connection, has the potential to ripple outward in ways we can never fully predict or measure, changing lives and building futures we cannot even imagine.